will be the last until the fall. And today we had a meeting, in fact, discussing the programs we will have in the fall. And Dr. Horowitz is the associate director, and he will introduce the participants, and then we'll get going.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here on this glorious spring day. Yes, this is our last roundtable on the topic of the senses, and this is on vision, of course. Before we get started, I want to introduce our panelists. So if you would raise your hand when I call your name. Alyssa Amanoff is an associate professor of psychology at Fordham University. Prior to joining the faculty at Fordham, she was a research scientist at Carnegie Mellon University in the Department of Psychology and was an adjunct faculty at the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Amanoff received her PhD from the Department of Psychology at Harvard University. She then went on to a postdoctoral fellowship at the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Amanoff uses an interdisciplinary approach by employing complementary methods to explore the cognitive neuroscience of visual scene understanding. Her research is at the intersection of vision and memory, exploring how the visual world is interpreted based on experience. She uses fMRI to explore how the human brain processes and represents objects, scenes, and the relationships between them. Dr. Kevin Chan is an assistant professor of ophthalmology, radiology, neuroscience, and biomedical engineering at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine and the New York University Tandon School of Engineering. He completed his doctoral studies in biomedical engineering at the University of Hong Kong and was awarded the Li Ka-shing Prize for the best PhD thesis at the university studying imaging of the visual system. At NYU, his laboratory focuses on new non-invasive methods for imaging neurodegeneration, neurodevelopment, and neuroplasticity in both humans and experimental animal models of vision-related diseases and injuries to guide vision preservation and restoration. His team combines the use of optical coherence tomography, magnetic resonance imaging, neuromodulation, and psychophysical assessments to determine the processes underlying the interplay among eye, brain, and behavior in health and disease. Dr. Paul Linton is a presidential scholar in neuroscience and society and a fellow of the Italian Academy at Columbia University, specializing in human 3D vision. He is the author of The Perception and Cognition of Visual Space and the lead editor of the Royal Society volume, New Approaches to 3D Vision. He has made significant contributions to our understanding of stereo vision, of course, how we see in 3D with both eyes, and is developing new approaches to visual scale, the perceived size and distance of objects, and visual shape, the perceived 3D shape of objects. He has worked on virtual reality as part of the Deep Focus team at Meta Reality Labs, and taught philosophy at both Oxford and UCLA. Kenneth Miller is the Peter Taylor Professor of Neuroscience, co-director of the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience and co-director of the Neurobiology and Behavior Graduate Program at Columbia University. He received his BA from Reed College, his MS and PhD with distinction from Stanford University, and completed his postdoctoral work at UCSF and Caltech. He is a founding member of the editorial board of Journal of Computational Neuroscience and has served as faculty for many years at various summer schools in theoretical and computational neuroscience. He received the Swartz Prize in Theoretical and Computational Neuroscience given by the Society for Neuroscience and has also been recipient of the Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship, Searle Scholars Award, and National Science Foundation Graduate Fellowship. Andrew Shum is an entrepreneur with a background in software engineering and artificial intelligence. He was co-founder of Thread Genius, which built computer vision algorithms for retail and e-commerce applications, including visual search and discovery. Thread Genius was acquired by auction house Sotheby's, where Andrew focused on expanding the auction business through machine learning technology. His team pioneered efforts to incorporate vision models for understanding consumer taste and price estimation of artwork. Before founding Thread Genius, he was a software engineer at Spotify, working on music recommendation problems. Andrew completed his undergraduate studies in computer science and physics at MIT. Okay, well, again, welcome everybody. We really interested in hearing what our panelists have to say today about vision. I thought one way to start off was a question that was raised while we were getting together here, which is related to why was the sequence for our course of roundtables on senses sequenced the way they were. We went from touch to taste to smell to hearing and then vision. And I think in some sense people feel vision may have a sort of a top spot in that hierarchy of senses. So I wondered if anyone wanted to take a shot at that and take it from there.
I don't know if it's really top shot, but if we really want to quantify like the bandwidth of the five senses, there are actually more than five senses. Well, so for smell and taste, probably it's hard to quantify, but we may have roughly 5 tastes, and then smell, we may be able to identify a couple of different chemicals, like mentioned last month, if I remember correctly, in a roundtable. Touch there are some ways you can quantify the the ability to differentiate texture, and you can differentiate from roughly 50 hertz all the way to 300 hertz. Sound, I think 2 weeks ago, one of our speakers mentioned we can actually detect from 200 hertz all the way to 20K hertz. Now, vision, we actually have a pretty wide bandwidth from in terms of nanometers, and we can detect from red all the way to violet. Some people may have a little bit of sense of beyond that. So the bandwidth, and you can also process everything in parallel of different features, right? The color, the texture, different scenes. That Elisa is really expert of it. So maybe that's one of the reasons that we try to phrase this way, and human actually occupies almost 1/3 of our brain dedicated to vision.
Actually, I wanted to inquire more about what you said about bandwidth, and the fact that there are more than 5. I guess, yeah, how I interpreted it was just sort of like the information density of like the content you're dealing with, whether like, I don't know, to me it's just like touch occupies like just less, it can be represented with like less bits than say like visual content. But what you had said about more than 5 senses, like, are you sort of, I was curious how you would like define a sense using those, I guess, dimensions or features.
I mean, another aspect is just a question of science, right? So how do you test these various different senses? And with vision, you can use displays for smell, for touch, for taste. It's always been very difficult to sort of isolate particular signals in that way. So I think historically as well, there's been a good reason why the last 200 years of sort of behavioral work has tended to focus primarily on vision.
I think also the reason why we feel vision is the most important is because we're primates. And primates evolved to heavily specialize in vision. Our cortex developed multiple areas to process vision, far more than for any of the other senses. So if you're a monkey, and we're basically monkeys, then vision is at the top.
And dominating and captivating in that sense, right? The vision is one of our most salient resources of our attention. And vision will get us more so than what's happening in our visual world will dominate how we experience the rest of our senses.
But for the rats on the street, vision is pretty low down. You know, touch and smell are much higher. So it really depends on how your sensory systems have evolved.
Yes, even though rats and mice are relatively poor in vision, it's actually amazing to know that for rodents, they are evolutionarily also have some preferential sensitivity. Like for rats, they usually, in the past, they were in the desert, and they have to avoid prey from the top of the surroundings. So they actually have a relatively high sensitivity towards the top of our visual field. Whereas for humans, actually, we are a little more sensitive towards the lower bottom of the field, probably because we want to avoid the obstacles on the floors. So even though the resolution is indeed different, but the vision is still playing some roles that may be important for different species. And if we extend it further, eagles actually have even sharper visions. And for humans, normal vision is 20/20. That means we can see vision for a normal subject. You can see an object that is about 20 feet. But for eagle, they can actually see something that is 25. That means you have to go all the way to 5 feet in front of the subject, to see something that the eagle can see 20 feet from that. So it is really amazing to understand how the world of vision is really evolving. And to explain further, jellyfish actually have 24 eyes for some of the species.
So a related question is, well, what do we all mean by vision, right? So we're sort of contrasting vision against these other senses, but I guess that we're probably all doing slightly different things with a slightly different focus. So if each of us had like a sentence to sort of highlight what we take to be the central question that we're sort of excited, why does vision get us out of bed in the morning, right?
I would say that it starts with light, and it's about how we've learned to interpret that light. And it can be very different for you and I. How that experience helps us to filter all the information that comes to our eyes, which is enormous. So talking about just the bandwidth and how much information we're getting through the light that hits our eyes is enormous, and our experience helps us to filter it and, again, concentrate on what is salient and most important to us. So my thought about vision is the perception of how we interpret the light that falls on our eye.
So in a brief few sentences, I think vision can be separated into two components, at least for humans. One is to form images, so you can really interpret the surroundings and environment, like Elisa mentioned. There's also another important feature that is to process non-image forming features. For example, I just came back from Seattle yesterday, actually, and on Tuesday I was actually back from Singapore. So all these light changes actually would affect our circadian rhythms, and all these are unconscious changes. And I'm half dozing, but at the same time, all these are actually important, but we may not be aware until there are some changes from the surroundings.
There's also something important about the formation of objects, how we segregate our world into different objects, and the role that vision plays in that, which I think may be pretty distinct compared to the other senses.
I think any sense you do that with. I mean, if you think about when you have your eyes closed and you're feeling something, you're inferring what kind of object it is. It's a glass, it's a bottle, it's a piece of paper. And I think, well, it depends on exactly what their nervous system wants to figure out about the world. But I think at least for many creatures, certainly for mammals, whatever senses they're using, they're forming objects. They're forming a picture of the objects in the world, at least the ones that they relate to. We just happen to really lean on vision to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I would argue it's definitely not vision in isolation. We understand objects by being in an environment in which we interact with things. That is how we understand objects, how we can work with them, the affordances that they give us, how we can separate them from the background, and if that is important to us. So vision is largely, I think, impacted by all of our other senses in order to segment objects from the background based on importance of our other senses.
I think Helen Keller has always been a good example of just understanding that we don't need vision to segregate objects. I mean, our brains make sense of the world with whatever senses they've got. And the fact that she could do it, without vision or hearing is just it's extraordinary, but it makes you realize, what it is our brains are in the process of doing with whatever sensory information it gets.
She was part of a cultural, she was part of a general culture already, right? So even though you're right, it's miraculous that she was able to create this sense of the world without vision and sound, but still she was learning from people who had those experiences, right? Well, surely, it's interesting, I think we have this panel of people on vision. I'm trying to get you all to crow about vision. And how everyone's saying it's no big deal, all the other senses to provide it. But so what's distinctive about it? What would you say? So what would you all say makes it distinctive?
Well, visual experience. I mean, it's very different to see something visually than to touch it or to taste it or to smell it, right? And so one thing I think we have to be cautious about is that there's a certain trend in cognitive science of just thinking of vision in terms of information processing, right? And so what you'd say is, well, vision gives us certain information, touch gives us certain information, smell, etc. And then the brain integrates all that information into a coherent sort of multisensory percept. And that's an account, and the brain's certainly doing something on that level, but you wouldn't want to let the term information get rid of the fact that we have very different experiences. Right? So if you just think of it in terms of information processing, and information integration, you're losing that sense in which the color red looks red, right? And it's very different from the sound of a bell, to use an example. So yeah, one of the challenges I think cognitive science and neuroscience is facing is how do we bring that experiential aspect back into the subject? It had always been there. It had been a sort of a key feature of the work in the 19th century. And then I think in the 20th century, it sort of disappeared in the early 20th century with a focus on behaviorism. It didn't in other subjects, like philosophy, for instance. It was always focused very heavily on raw experience. And so, yeah, I think one of the challenges for us is to bring that experiential aspect back into cognitive and neuroscience.
In terms of information processing, actually, there are some basic rules on how to define vision as from the psychology of consciousness point of view. A few of them may include, for vision, you have a limited field of view, so your objects may be not perceived if you're outside of this field of view. If you put a bottle versus a table together, you'll be able to perceive the front and the back, the depth perception. And if you move around or you rotate the object, you may be able to perceive it is the same object, or you can also see different sizes when you move around or, to the close place or more near-sighted space. So if we can use sound or touch to understand these features, could that also be at least indirectly vision? That is something perhaps we can discuss further. And our lab actually has been trying to help some of our blind subjects to use other remaining senses, like the sound and also the touch, to interact with the visual environment. And we are trying hard to, for example, use some video cameras to convert visual images into these sound and touch features and see how we can try to further interact with these low-level features of the vision, even though they don't have input from the eyeballs.
Yeah, I think if you were to ask people, if you were only choose one sense, I think most people would choose vision to sort of keep. But if you were asked them the question, which is the most pleasurable to, I think you would get uniformly distributed answers. At least that's what I've found in my experience.
I think one of the challenges of thinking about information processing is that it can change very much with a goal and what you're trying to get out of the visual information. And our brain segments visual information based on those goals. You can go as broad as thinking about just understanding where things are in space versus identifying what it is. And so there's not one type of information processing. And I think we don't know actually all the different types of information processing that we're doing with visual information. And I think that brings us to a complexity of trying to understand it computationally, because there's so much about a human using this visual information rather than something like a computer.
So how are we going to answer the questions of vision then? I think everyone around the table uses very different techniques and approaches. Why do people favor certain approaches over others?
I'm not sure it's exactly addressing that, but I think part of, I mean, like I was trying to think about, well, why did primates focus on vision? And I don't think we know exactly the answer, but if you think about the different senses, vision lets you scan the world. You can look out at distances, you can look out and see what is out there. Hearing, you can't scan the world. Something has to make a noise in order for you to hear it. Something doesn't have to make a light in order for you to see it. Smell, again, you can only sample the smells that come to your nose. You can't just scan the world with smell or with taste or with touch. And so I imagine that ability to scan the world for things, for affordances, for things that the animal wants to make use of must have been somehow driving primates to specialize on vision, but it's just a speculation.
But that assumes that we're in light.
Yes, in the dark, obviously, it's not so good.
Yep.
And also, echolocation gives you the same ability, which, so a number of animals have. So they can also scan the world and form images of, all the objects around them.
But which sense is most essential for life?
For life, I don't think life just evolves in so many different forms and in so many different niches, and each one maybe has different sensory requirements.
How about for human life?
Say it again?
For survival.
Well, again, that's life, but I mean, it depends on which ecological niche you're trying to survive in and how you evolved. For us, clearly vision, I think, but.
There's actually a few surveys trying to understand if someone got cancer, if someone lose their arms, lose their sight, hearing, which one they fear the most. Sight is actually the most important one that they will fear the most. And when we talk to the blind patients or people, especially when they were acquiring their blindness late, actually they always say the first thing they want to know is really like the deafness similar to the echolocation, because they do not really develop those echolocation intrinsically. But once they lose their sight, the thing they can really interact is actually something that's within their hand-reaching distance. So they want to know further. When you get into this room, for example, if you have no light, it's total darkness. So what is happening? How many people are around? Will we bump into a chair or a table? So all these actually scanning of the view with a few shots of vision actually is really important compared to other senses, I would say.
I'm just curious. I think this is probably an answer you would know, but like in terms of information processing time, would the fastest be vision or another sense?
Not sure about this actually. Yeah. But in vision, there are also slow conduction velocities for like color processing. There's also fast conduction velocities for like changes in contrast. So how are they directly compared to sound? I guess it really is more complicated if we want to directly compare them.
And what's the end goal there? Like you can count how long it takes for primary visual cortex to respond to light, but that doesn't tell us very much. That's not, if we stopped vision then, we wouldn't understand very much about what we're seeing.
Right. There's like the process of internalizing that information and making sense of it. Yeah.
Yeah, with that said, there is also conscious vision that is really through the entire visual pathway, including the cortex. But there are also patients who have their cortex actually got removed or damaged because of stroke, for example. They're called cortical blindness. These people, even though they cannot really interpret or perceive vision consciously, if we ask them to guess whether they see something, they could often be able to get the right choice by above chance. So somehow we call it blind sight or unconscious vision. Some people argue about this term, but there are actually some pathway that may be related to this kind of unconscious or subconscious vision. These may be a little faster than conscious vision, or maybe there are pathways that are connecting to different parts of the brain when their cortex is damaged. So it really depends on the situation, I guess. Yeah.
There was a recent, I think this past week or so, is an article in Nature about, it's about fish, and the fish they found in this, whatever ecosystem it is, the ones that were explored more, the species that were engaged more in exploration seemed to play a greater role in the further development, evolutionary development. So there was more diversity in those types of fishes that were exploratory as opposed to the ones that were less exploratory, and almost as if it accelerated the natural selection process. So I was interested in this idea about scanning, which is, of course, one of the ways we explore the environment. I'm wondering about scanning and what that might have to do with our attention and our memory and things like that. I wonder if...
So I had a very simple task in my lab where we just had to look at scenes and we just had to label all the objects in there. There was no time limit. We were doing this to get a database of images and the objects in them. And the amount of individual variability there was astounding to me, actually. That, I saw a tree, somebody else totally didn't see a tree, somebody else saw a chair, I didn't see the chair, and it was astounding to me how much what I see in that scene is different than compared to another person. And then once I see, okay, I should be looking for a chair, where's that chair? I see the chair. But attention is everything.
Yeah, there's also an interesting experiment called the invisible gorilla, right? So that means, you may have heard of it, like people are passing the basketball for people who are wearing white shirts versus black shirts, and then the task was to count how many passes were for the white shirts. In the end, most people can count it correctly, but actually the pun is there's actually a gorilla, which is black, walking around the scene, and they were not able to... I'm sorry. Yes. Right. Yeah. So this may be.
That was the second one.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that was Dan Simons and Chris Chabris.
Yep. Exactly.
And it's amazing. I mean, you do it every time. Like every class I show that, everybody falls for it every single time.
Yep. Yeah. If we move even closer to recent social media sharing, there's also a post that is comparing, asking you about the dress, right? There's a blue dress that has some blue and dark bands, and people ask you, what do you see? What color you see? Actually, a lot of people see the blue and the black band, but quite a lot of other people also see this as a gold dress. So even though it's the same picture, you can actually perceive differently. Maybe it's related to the brain experience. Maybe it's related to cognition. I'm not the experiment.
There's a lot of data on that to say that it's about how you interpret the scene. And if you're looking at the dress within a shadow or within direct light, and that is how you interpret the color. So there's been a lot of research, like whole issues of journals on interpreting how we perceive the dress.
But I think what that's getting at is that, our naive experience is that we're sort of, our eyes are like a camera. We open our eyes, the light comes in, and there's a picture. And it's not like that at all. The brain has to infer the picture and paint the picture. And one of the inferences that it does is it infers the color of an object. So if the light coming from an object is yellow light, that doesn't mean that the brain perceives it as yellow, because the brain has to compare it to the illuminant. If the illuminant is almost all yellow, then all the objects are going to be primarily yellow, but the brain tries to infer, well, that one is reflecting more green. Well, that one is reflecting more blue. And that's how your brain assigns colors. And that's why the blue dress looked different colors to different people, because it just happened to be an unusual picture that brains could interpret in two different ways in terms of what was the illuminant and what was the object. And your brain is computing what's the reflectance of the object. And if your brain makes a different assumption about what the illuminant was, then it makes a different conclusion about what the reflectance was and what the color is. That picture just happened to be right at the cusp between two different interpretations.
There's a great picture of a bowl of strawberries. There's a lot of people that study color, and one of them has this picture of a bowl of strawberries, and it's actually black and white, but you can swear that those strawberries are red, and you really interpret those strawberries as red. And then when you isolate just a patch of that picture, you can see that it's completely gray. And all my students fall for this and are astounded that their vision tricked them so much. But it's how we interpret the world. And if we didn't do this to help facilitate vision, it would take forever to put one foot in front of the other, because we would take so long to process everything. We have to use our experience to help interpret in order to move things along.
Well, I don't think we do use our experience, but I think a lot of this is built in by evolution. I mean, evolution knew how to do the computation of the reflectance. And similarly, the size of objects. If you're on a beach and you see people far away, if you perceive them at the size they are on your retina, you would think they were ants. But they're people because your brain actually blows them up and makes them bigger in the image you perceive than they are on your retina, because your brain computes that they're far away and therefore makes it bigger. And that's believed to be why the moon looks much bigger when it's on the horizon, because on the horizon there's a lot of things between you and it, and your brain says, oh, that's far away, and it makes it bigger.
This is actually a very topical and very hot problem in self-driving cars right now. It's just how to deal with these edge cases by providing experience or data. There's a famous incident in which Tesla autopilot crashed into a truck because it was stopped at a intersection, and a truck rolls by and it's the same color as the sky, and so. That's a particular edge case because it hasn't seen trucks that look like that apparently. So, yeah, no, it's interesting to see the parallel between the human experience and using that part of the brain to kind of, merge what you perceive. And I think that kind of relates with the case with the blue/black dress. It's I think the people who are kind of, people who know anything a bit about photography or how kind of exposure works, they might be able to kind of adjust the blue color by, knowing that, that camera exposure was probably way high. And if they were taken at a normal exposure, it would be a black dress.
But it's interesting that we're discussing images, right? In terms rather than sort of real world or objects. So I think the 20th century in terms of vision science has been very dominated by images on displays. Be very interesting to see how that changes as we go further towards virtual and augmented reality. We're getting what's known as more ecologically valid. So you can sort of move through a scene. You can understand the scene slightly better. So in the case of the dress, for instance, the illuminant would be there in the scene with you, in addition to the dress, in addition to all the other things. So it's an interesting question, right? Have we been studying vision or have we been studying picture perception?
So just for two things to that is, so we are dominated by studying images, for example, in the scanner, right? Looking at using fMRI to understand how the brain processes vision. We've been stuck with images, right? Jody Cullum has been able to bring 3D real-world objects into the scanner, and has people looking at real objects versus picture, and how much more that elicits activity in the brain, and how much more the brain is active, and how the big differences is important. And astounding in a lot of ways. So I think it is really important. And there's a lot of work being done about understanding vision and making judgments about vision when you're actually standing in the environment, which is different than looking at a picture.
I mean, how much in these instances is that you might have the potential to interact with the object, versus where right from the beginning I cannot interact with it. What role that plays in our visual understanding?
I think it's huge. I don't think that we trick the brain by saying that an image is the same thing as, holding a chocolate bar versus seeing a chocolate bar is very different, right? And this goes again to the fact that vision is not done in isolation, and we don't see things in isolation of the rest of human cognition. And so I don't think we trick the brain, and but it's a kind of a necessary design in order to have a lot of control to be able to study different aspects of vision.
There's a very interesting project similar to what you said, but the project is called Project Prakash, and it's actually a very meaningful outreach to the villages that are relatively developing, underdeveloped in northern India, and the physicians try to screen people who are congenitally blind but potentially treatable towards the adulthood or teenagers' time. So when they were able to, for example, replace their cataracts when they're born blind, during adulthood, and then we gave for example, a card of the same object versus a real object. These patients were only able to use their touch in the past, right, before the treatment. When we're immediately showing the two together and put two different objects together, for example, they were not able to recognize from the image without interaction. But with some more experience, they will be able to gradually really identify using those images. So there's something related to interactions, experience. At the same time, going back there, the brain may also be hardwired evolutionarily, even if someone is congenitally blind. And we try to use the technique we mentioned, using sound to interpret some words, or maybe use touch to read Braille. There are some visual word form areas. That means brain regions that originally thought to be for interpreting words would also be recruited. So over there's both nature and nurture putting together.
I mean, on the flip side, one of the questions I work on is distance perception. So how do I know the distance of an object? And the more and more I work on distance perception, that actually, funnily enough, the less and less I'm convinced that it's that important that you're in the scene. So people talk about sort of the motion of your body, but actually when you isolate that in experiments, that doesn't seem to make a massive contribution. People talk about the angle of inclination of the floor or of a table. Again, it's sort of quite debatable in experiments. And then you think, well, we spent sort of 2 years in a pandemic, looking at each other on video screens, very rarely making gross errors in terms of the scale of scenes. So that's one context where the more I work on it, the more I think actually we're quite similar judging scale in the real world and also in pictures.
Can I ask a question? It doesn't matter, it doesn't play a role like knowing your size in relation to everything else? So like I know the distance of how far my arm goes out. Doesn't that help me interpret everything else?
Sure. But in terms of, I'm just trying to think. So there's definitely some benefits of stereo vision. So having the two eyes, so you can increase or separate the separation between the eyes, and that will affect scale judgments. But actually, when you look at that seems to be a very, very high-level process that doesn't rely on sort of basic mechanisms. So, for instance, it was thought the visual system just had a rangefinder from the two eyes rotating and fixating on it. That doesn't seem to work. So it's interesting because you look at the textbooks, they say, well, look, you've got all of these sort of what they call triangulation cues, right? It's sort of different viewpoints, so from which you can sort of infer, like you would in computer vision, the position. Doesn't seem that human vision's doing that. It seems like it's treating even the real world scene, in my research at least, right? And I can be wrong. A bit more like the pictorial case. Yeah.
How similar are you sort of comparing these tasks? Because I think it's like, to me, like you task a machine to like estimate distance, like it's going to give you a pretty precise answer versus asking a human. I mean, they could probably tell you, I mean, this is not my field of research, but they could tell you like relative distance, but, kind of giving you the answer of, oh, this is like 1 meter versus like 1.1. I think it's probably a bit more hairy.
I mean, it falls off the distance, but I think it's fair, and where I tend to test things is really in reaching and grasping. And there you really, people, they have a bit of online control so you can sort of see your hand, but actually I don't think that plays a massive role.
Somehow, if we move from the zoom 2D images back to a little bit in the early 19th centuries, I guess one of the famous painters, Picasso, is actually also interested in those depth perceptions. But if you look into his own portrait, his right eye is actually kind of misaligned with the left eye. So potentially he may not be able to really focus on the depth perception. But that actually gives him an advantage of seeing things in 2D, like in a zoom view, and he has a very strong visual memory. He can stare into an object for a very long time, and after going, this subject or object is gone, he can still paint it and add his own interpretation. So if we want to go back to the question, is it just vision from the eye, or there's something interpreted by brain? Maybe visual memory also plays a very important role along with this experience.
It sort of suggests, doesn't it, that there's some more holistic processing and top-down processing that accounts for what you're finding in your research?
Yeah. So definitely not and I'm happy to be wrong about this, right? But for my own stuff, the way I think of visual scale is much more, I would say, quote unquote, cognitive in its relation than the 3D shape of an object, which I think is provided by stereo vision pretty directly, which is the depth perception from the difference between the two eyes. And that's interesting because you can mess around with other sources of visual information like shading and perspective, and very rarely does that seem to impede that immediate percept of 3D shape from stereo. So in my own work, at least, I draw a sharp distinction between 3D shape and scale, but I can imagine other people don't.
Well, regarding top-down attention or feedback, goal-oriented states, we were also interested in the meaning of the visual cortex. That means the brain areas at the back of the brain. And are they actually playing some roles from the eye towards the brain that is more top-down? Or if there is nothing inputting from the eyeballs, is the brain, so-called visual brain, is it still using a use it or lose it principle, right? It turns out that if there are patients who have gone blind, either congenitally or late, we were able to still recruit the so-called visual area of the brain and make, at least from the functional imaging point of view, they will become active when we perform some other tasks from the other senses. One of the potential meaning we're still looking into it is maybe related to the top-down attention. Perhaps even for normal vision, there is the so-called goal-oriented task. But even if you have no more input from the eye, it may still be running in terms of these selective attention tasks, but using other senses. Maybe there are some repurposing, and a lot of people were saying that for blind patients, they may be having supernatural senses of the sound or touch. Does that mean this is because they have a spared visual area that can help to run these? So the brain is fantastic. We're still looking into the meaning of it right now. Yeah.
And just to add to thinking about top-down and thinking about how the brain is wired, there's been a lot of work to say that we have a lot more connections going feedback and going from more higher areas to lower areas than bottom up, which says that there's a much stronger need for and influence of kind of top-down information rather than bottom-up, even at the thalamus, where we would think the thalamus is one of the first places that the information from the eye goes, and we would think, and then that goes to visual cortex, and we think that should be a pretty bottom-up place. And it turns out, actually, that there is more feedback connections going into the LGN, the thalamus, rather than the other way, which again suggests that so much of what we see is interpreted through our top-down expectations and feedback.
So to sort of build on that, there's a big debate in the field. I mean, but different people take different positions, and even within vision, I think there's sort of schools who would focus on one aspect rather than others. So if you have light coming into the eye, landing on the retina, it goes into the middle, which is the LGN you were just discussing. Then it goes to the back of the brain, the primary visual cortex. And then the suggestion is called V1, and then the suggestion is it goes in sort of two visual streams. So one's called the dorsal visual stream, which is along the top, which people associate primarily with action. And then the other is the ventral visual stream, which goes along the bottom, which is primarily people associate with object identification and sort of similar kind of judgments about the scene. So you've got all of that. That's a general model. People emphasize certain aspects, downplay others. Then you've got a separate question, which is visual experience, right? We just have visual experiences. And so there's a real debate of if we have visual experiences, where should we think about them sort of being processed primarily? Should we think of them as being towards the front of the brain, which is where, if it travels this way, prefrontal cortex, where you're making more sort of heavy cognitive inferences, or should we think it being primarily a back of the brain phenomenon? And I find that really fascinating. I think that's really interesting. There's just no real consensus as to how we should think about those questions.
I agree, and well, there are some sort of thoughts of people saying maybe the brain is only 10% used, but actually it's probably not true. In our brain imaging, we found that when there's a task involved, or even when they're just daydreaming, the whole brain is actually coordinating with each other. It is probably involving those bottom-up pathway from the eye towards the V1, and then those dorsal ventral stream, but it is likely also involving a lot of attention networks, default mode network, executive networks, all together running depending on the situation.
I mean, just to add, so quite useful, because you might be thinking, oh, we're all discussing human vision, right? But what about AI, right? And the interesting things from that. What I would just briefly note is that ventral part stream I was discussing from the primary visual cortex down the bottom of the brain, that sort of way of carving up the processing is actually what was the inspiration for the most recent sort of AI models of vision.
Yeah, you're referring to convolutional neural nets, right? Yeah, it's actually, from what I call it, it exactly mimics how the visual areas are linked together with kind of the base layers processing things like, detecting things like the edge of certain objects, working your way up, it will then detect textures and then different features like eyeballs or the presence of ears. And these are all kind of linked together to be used to, basically detect certain objects like animals and machines and stuff like that. Yeah, and then it's sort of interesting how that model then kind of improved over the years. I think the first that really kind of made headlines was in 2012. It was called AlexNet, and that was kind of the first real implementation that kind of made a huge difference in sort of all the machine learning models that preceded it. And then all the kind of improvements that were made on top of that were quite interesting, because they all had to do with sort of like how much information do you retain as you go from the base layer or visual area. I think it's 5 or 4 and all the way up. It's also interesting kind of seeing just where the limitations of where you can draw the parallels between what's going on in the visual cortex and how the machine learning models work. I think OpenAI had this example where they would take an image of like a gorilla and make these very minute changes just on the pixel level. Essentially, to our eyes, it would just appear as like an image of white noise. They would then add it onto this image, and it could actually trick the model to believe that it was not a gorilla, but indeed another sort of primate. But just from a human perceptual level, they looked identical. So it's interesting, I think, kind of from the computer model level, I think what they had to do was that what's going on kind of the neural net level, it's like processing very much pixel by pixel, whereas humans kind of take a more holistic approach to object detection and object recognition. Yeah.
So great.
I think just going back to the top-down discussion and convolutional models and the evolution of convolutional models since 2012 is incorporating top-down feedback, actually, and having those connections go from the higher levels of the DNNs to talk to the lower levels to segment what features and what visual information should be important, hopefully kind of building on just a pixel-by-pixel model.
And if you read the title of this roundtable is synthetic consciousness, right? If we go, this term is probably analogous to the one AI term, right, called artificial consciousness. I guess right now we are at a machine learning stage, which is kind of narrow knowledge learning, but there could be a potential move towards the machine consciousness stage. What do you think about this?
Yeah, no, it's incredible seeing how fast all this changed since 2012, because basically the state of machine learning / AI and deep learning from like 2012 to 2017 was that is basically we had to figure out how to like mathematically model the visual cortex and mimic what's going on back here. We were able to teach machines to recognize items and kind of detect where items are and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden in 2017, we had come up with this thing called attention. I think it's modeled after kind of the concept of attention in the psych world. But essentially, it allowed these machines to basically retain the information that it needed to then solve more complex problems. And that was actually the key technique that led to the invention of models like ChatGPT and LLMs, stuff like that. We're then able to allow these machines to solve like much more complex tasks and also generate just way more in terms of language output. And actually, like that plus a bunch of other key innovations like led to this kind of just huge amounts of research in sort of like generative AI, which back during the 2012 to 2017 era, it was extremely nascent. Like I think the most advanced technology were generative adversarial networks, aka GANs. And if you compare the results from that era to like now, it's just night and day. And that I think one of the key innovations was incorporating a number of techniques, one of which is attention. Yeah.
I think what's called attention in deep nets and what's called attention by psychologists are.
Yeah.
It's the same word, but it's not clear it's the same concept at all.
Yeah, the attention in the sort of deep nets world is sort of, I guess one way to put it is just figure out a more efficient way to retain state in the areas that matter. Previously there was the sort of like models that had been on the cutting edge for natural language processing were recurrent neural nets, aka RNNs, and they would run into this problem called like the vanishing gradient problem. And it just basically, when you're feeding these neural nets with like just a lot of text-based information, it would try to just hold way too much state about all the words. And in fact, it would get really good at kind of just the words at the end of, like, say, a paragraph, and kind of forget a lot of the stuff in the beginning. And suddenly, with this attention mechanism, we could actually, figure out the right things to focus on when we feed this data into neural nets.
I just wanted to go back to this. These two pathways that you mentioned, Paul. Those are the sort of what and where pathways. That's how they're commonly referred to, right? The dorsal being the where, and the ventral being what, right? I just wanted to add that for people who are interested in looking for it. I think it's really interesting that we're talking about this top-down approach to understanding it, and we started off also for a while discussing how many, in the ways that our vision is not like a camera. It seems like we'd like to think of it being built up of these elements that are camera-like elements, where there's data and you build up a picture. And we realize, well, that doesn't quite work. And now we see neural net approaches trying to model attention, let's say. Whether they do that well or not is, I guess, still being worked out. Do you think that the ambiguities in these lower levels is an advantage? I mean, these ambiguities, like, for example, in the color confusion and the ways in which we can't quite figure out, why do we know all the elements of distance, it seems, neuroanatomically, and yet it doesn't add up to a distance. So do you think some of the elements being looser or a little bit more ambiguous plays a role in how well we see?
I think it's more an issue of we don't perceive the world in terms of the light at each pixel. We perceive the world in terms of objects. And so the brain has to infer what are the distinct objects, what are their properties, what's their color, what's their shape, what's their size, how are they, where are they. And I think it's, you start with the raw information, and you have to, to interpret it at that level of objects is very ambiguous. It requires quite a lot of inference, which the brain has to do in order before you can see anything, before the picture gets painted that you see. So I don't think that there's an advantage in being ambiguous. It's just that it's inherently ambiguous. The light that comes into the retina potentially has, there's many interpretations that are consistent with that pattern of light. Your brain has to figure out what's the most likely one, which it usually gets more or less exactly right. I mean, it's really good. But there are cases, of illusions where it's ambiguous.
Even before getting into the brain, if we refer to what you said about the camera structure, you have a lens similar to the eye lens in the camera versus the eye. But in the retina, it's different. For camera, you probably would get a high definition picture of every places. But for human eyes, we have the fovea or macula, which is corresponding to the central vision. You have very dense photoreceptor responsible for colors called the cones, whereas for the surroundings of these central visions, they are relatively low resolution. We use them for low vision or low luminance vision. They are very highly populated by roves. They may be of different purposes. For example, for the fovea, the high density cones, they may be ready for sharp images. But in terms of ambiguity, maybe if you want to at least navigate in a dark room, or if there is something suddenly from the surrounding just slap over and you want to avoid it, in terms of these motion salience entries, then maybe you don't really need very sharp vision, and perhaps that would give you some room for you to compare between the
Computationally
situations.
more efficient?
Possibly, right?
To have a phobia and then poor resolution. There are many various conjectures and theories about that. I don't think there's any definitive answer. But I guess it is another way, just one more illustration of the fact that your brain has to do a lot of inference to paint the picture that you see, which is that in reality there's only, like a thumbnail width at an arm's length that you really see clearly. And the rest you don't see very clearly at all, but you don't know that because from your eyes moving around and seeing things clearly, your brain paints a picture as if you're seeing everything clearly at once, and you're not.
Included, like all the way out here, we actually don't see color, right? We think we see color, and we fill in color, but we don't at all. And it just shows, how much is being filled in that is beyond what a camera would do, what a camera would pick up. So,
and in terms of the top-down and bottom-up, I should say, it's true that there's generally more top-down than bottom-up projections, but there's a long-standing discussion, debate, what that means, because the bottom-up projections tend to be driving. Murray Sherman from Chicago, Chicago, came up with this distinction between drivers and modulators, and they're actually different properties of the synapses that make them drivers or modulators. But so the top-down tend much more to be modulators. There's a lot more of them, and yet they sort of have less control over how the neuron responds. It's much more bottom-up driven, but clearly the modulation is doing a lot because in the end we have to do this inference that requires putting a lot of things together. But how that works is something that's really very unclear.
Yeah. And something you may be aware is that everyone not only have a yellow spot as the central vision, everyone may also have a blind spot. Actually, should have a blind spot. But our brain is able to interpret and try to fill out those blind spots by using your other eye, or in some cases when you have a disease like glaucoma, sometimes you have a localized visual deficits. The brain may also be able to help adapt and fill out the deficits using the other eyeball. This may be something ambiguous but helpful to understand the surrounding. Having said that, we also need to be cautious because if you are really driving and it happens, maybe there's a kid coming over and it's in your blind spot and the brain actually fills that gap with other things, then you need to be cautious to avoid any hazards. Yeah. And just fun fact, we talked about fovea, and we briefly touch upon egos, and actually egos has two foveas. But what's the purpose? Probably is there top down for that? I don't know for these, but it's just fun facts. Yeah.
the two foveas converge and
Oh no, one of them is more 45 degrees, with the other, and more in the deepest end of the retina. The other is 15% more shallow. So maybe they are really focusing on different aspects when catching the mice, maybe. And then the mice are trying to avoid them from the top of the view.
There's some unexpected implications for having these high-resolution foveas that you've got to move your eyes to fixate on different things for stuff like depth perception. So if you think that stereo vision, which relies on the positions of the two eyes, is taking points on the retina, on the back of the eye, and projecting out into the world and working out where these different points intersect in the world, well, the problem is that now your eyes are moving all over the place. So you no longer have a real sense of how to go from points on the retina, on the back of the eye, to points in the world, unless you know what the rotation of your eyes are. Similar things. So I talked about motion parallax. So the information as you move in the scene, things closer move more than things in the back. But now if you want to fixate on something of interest with your high-resolution fovea, actually your eye is going to stabilize it. And that's also going to complicate the motion parallax calculations. So all of these little things feed in and make everything super difficult. It's a wonder that we see it all.
so one other thing I want to mention, like in comparison to camera, in comparison to AI, and computer vision, is that we don't have one stream of processing visual information, right? In the brain, we have multiple streams. One of them, like the kind of the biggest way to break it up beyond the what and the how pathways, but is motion and very crude processing of things are moving, there's contrast, I need to orient towards that, versus very high resolution, color, and detail. And we are processing vision simultaneously in these two pathways. And I think that poses something very different than, as far as I know, what is implemented in computer vision these days, and clearly what a camera would pick up. So, which says that I think animal vision has, again, doing multiple things with visual information. And again, what's this information processing? There's not one answer.
We've talked a lot about the occipital lobes and the ways in which this information gets back there to the visual cortex and then may come forward. We haven't spoken. I was eager to hear a little bit more about attention and, let's say, the frontal eye fields, which haven't come up in our conversation yet. So I wonder if anyone wants to take a whack at that, how that may, because there's this other interesting issue of attention generally, where we seem to be able to focus our mind's eye internally. Thank you. So I was just curious about that idea, is like a more, how vision may be, like a general template for attention for all.
I will say, when you look at attention in the brain, one of the major areas is the frontal eye fields, because where we look is so tied to where we're attending. You can't really differentiate that very well.
And just to add on top, we have actually touched a bit, there's a region called superior colliculus, which is below the cortex, and it's actually a multi-sensory and multi-motor area. It coordinates between vision, sound, and touch, and also the eye movement. It may also coordinate with the frontal eye field. It may be related to the attentions. That's all I know.
Well, that's also part of why that plays a role in blind sight, I think, also, right? Because people respond to things through that pathway.
Yep.
Yeah, it was, I mean, I'm no expert on this, but it was surprising when people found that the superior colliculus, which is a subcortical structure, plays a major role in determining where your attention is. And this wasn't expected. It was always assumed it was in the cortex. And it is. I mean, it's shared, but I wish I could remember the experiments. But Rich Krauslitz did these experiments where he really showed that, by some measures that I can't remember, that the superior colliculus is kind of the much bigger factor in where your attention is. And that's, the superior colliculus is sort of, probably somebody could really argue with this and tear it down, but, you know, roughly it's what the frog sees with, you know, and then we've replaced that with we put the cortex on top of that, And that's most of what we see with, but there's still this old pathway there that's doing a lot of our orienting and attending.
With that said, if we go back to some patients with visual deprivation, the blind patients, when we look into the brain, when they're at rest, the visual cortical area again, they may actually coordinate a little bit stronger with those attention networks. So there's something happening in those areas that are contributing to attention. They could be beyond those cortical superior colliculus areas. Yeah.
But what you were talking about before, I mean, attentional blindness, and it just basically, if you're not attending to something, you don't see it, roughly. I mean, if something's moving, it catches your attention. So you have to be able to see things for them to catch your attention. But
if you're otherwise kind of occupied, you're not going to see it.
I mean, this goes back to that example you gave with the gorilla or man in the gorilla suit. Right, if we're like occupied, it's like with a task, we like hone in on we attend to, I guess, like certain parts in the scene rather than others.
The visual, many of us anyway can imagine visual scenes without actually seeing them, and there are others who apparently aren't good at doing that. I mean, what role do you think that plays in, let's say, vision generally, and then also imagination, I guess, if anyone wants to take a whack at that?
Can I piggyback off the top of that to ask a further question, more controversial? I mean, I really think those kinds of questions go to the very nature of visual consciousness, right? So one view of what it is to be conscious, to have visual experience, is that there's like an internal movie going on in the head somewhere. Right, and it's funny, you talk to a bunch of scientists about, say, 50 to 70% say that that's utter rubbish, but then sort of 50 to 30% say, well, maybe there's something in that. And I think to the extent people say that, well, maybe there's something in that, that does seem to be a fairly accurate description of what goes on when we dream, right? So, is there a parallel between visual experience, quote unquote, when we dream, and visual experience when we're here in the real world, type thing, right? So what that goes to is title of the thing is synthetic consciousness, seeing and believing. You asked the question about AI consciousness. I mean, before you can even get to that, you've got to get to human consciousness, right? And then the question is, well, how do you even begin to sort of theorize, categorize, think about what it is to be a conscious being, and I ultimately think that's probably the reason. Well, certainly the reason why I study the brain, right? I don't study the liver, for instance, and that's because it has this quality of visual experience which just doesn't exist in any other organ. So.
Yeah, not many species can dream, first of all. And secondly, when we are dreaming, actually, there is rapid eye movement. There is also some metabolism happening. One of them is called the cholinergic nervous system that's involved. And one of the major brain regions involved is the basal forebrain. All these can contribute to attention, dreaming, all these. What happens when you are really strongly focusing on a certain event, perhaps you are really training up or really modulating these neurometabolites and transmitting substances. So how these interact with each other when there is sufficient related disorder, very often our lab and others also observe these neurochemicals can be altered. So when one person is perceiving the world of the same scenes, would another person be also seeing slightly different views because of the neurochemical changes? It's still a lot of work we have to do with, how can we modulate better to make it, the title is seeing is believing, but if everyone is seeing different things, what's the right way to do, to be eyewitness, for example, going back to the theme of this topic.
Sorry, Paul, I just want to go back to, are you trying to say if people don't have mental imagery, they're not conscious?
No, not at all. But
okay.
What I'm saying is that mental imagery, or I'd like to focus more on dreaming, right? I think
dreaming in images.
Yeah, I mean, what I experience, when I wake up or having had a dream at night is a vivid, I would say, three-dimensional visual experience.
Some people don't have that.
Oh, for sure. But what I'm saying is, given that exists in a lot of people, is that an interesting way of thinking about everyday vision, right? It's a sort of internally generated 3D movie, right? Some people call that the Cartesian theater, and then they add it's a fallacy, right? So it's a Cartesian theater fallacy, Dan Dennett's work and stuff like that. I think it was very much dismissed in the 90s, but increasingly as people think in a number of different ways about vision, so predictive processing theorists about vision would I think, be inclined to thinking of vision as a sort of controlled hallucination or something like that. I just think it's fascinating. Forget the theory of vision, the fact that we have dreams. If the brain's able to generate an internal 3D experience of objects like that in dreams, right, feels that vision must be fairly close.
Yeah, I think that imagery has become a very kind of hot topic recently, and there's these cases of aphantasia where people don't have any mental imagery, and it turns out that, and so once something like that comes into more popular attention, then people are like, oh wait, that's me, and it becomes much more apparent. So. And this is happening with visual mental imagery, and we actually just did a study on mental imagery, just getting people of the general public to do a study, and the variability on visual imagery is astounding, right? I keep on saying astounding because vision is astounding, but we know actually, I think, very little. We assumed mental imagery and then studied mental imagery without thinking so much about it being on a spectrum.
Yeah, I think actually that I'm either I either have aphantasia or I'm very close to it. I have very, very little visual imagery. But I have absolutely normal dreams. I see everything clearly in dreams. So my brain is capable of generating images on its own, but it won't do it, on command.
Well, maybe so just jumping. I mean, that also feels like as you were saying, the top down is modulatory, but not necessarily excitatory. And so if you've already got a visual stimulus, I guess in the imagery case you can close your eyes, right? And so that would remove the visual stimulus to some extent. But it's that interesting. Yeah.
And I do think, I guess I'm along the lines of it's a controlled hallucination, and that, what I've been emphasizing a lot is that your brain has to compute and paint this picture. You don't just open your eyes and see. And in normal vision, that the picture that gets computed is very tightly anchored to the incoming information. But it still has to be inferred and computed, and we still have there's lots of visual information in there that you don't consciously see. And we have basically no idea what it is in the neural activity that makes, the part that we are conscious of and where all the rest goes. And we just have no idea. But it's very clear that same hallucinating process can run quite free of incoming information during dreams, for example, or for people who can close their eyes and mentally image.
I mean, could I follow up on that? Yeah. So, I mean, a related question, I think the answer is going to be we just don't know. But is there a place you would hypothesize, right? So rather than we know, where it all comes together, right? Because it feels like in our visual experience, it all comes together in this beautiful percept. But then if you read the textbooks, often they'll be like, okay, but color's processed here, and this is processed here, and right? It all seems distributed throughout the brain. So,
I mean, I think it's a bigger issue of how the brain works, and that we have a unitary experience. The world is ambiguous, but you see one thing, you hear one thing, you take one action. You may plan multiple actions, but you're not, unless in some very abnormal states, you're not fighting with yourself across many different actions trying to be executed. You always arrive at a unified interpretation of this ambiguity. And and there's even cases of like binocular rivalry where the two eyes are getting two different bits of information, two different images, and you could see either one, or you could see one on top of the other, but at least in some circumstances, first you see one, then you see the other, then you see one, then you see the other. Your brain is always deciding on one, even though there's two things clearly there that it could see. And that whole process, I mean, it's much more than vision. It's our whole experience. Every sense, every action, there's a unity. There's a single thing that the brain decides on, and we have no idea how that happens.
And I would say, yeah, there's some areas that we consider to be vision, but that's small compared to the amount of brain that is actually processing visual information. Once you get past primary visual cortex, these regions can be activated by lots of different information that doesn't have to be vision specific. So I think most of the brain is actually integrating vision with kind of the rest of cognition: memory, language, conceptual understanding, navigation, spatial understanding.
And there are actually brain circuits not only connected between the primary visual cortex to these areas. There are some recent studies suggesting that eye may also have some indirect or direct fibers connected to these memory, emotion control, circadian rhythm, etc., etc. And since we are crossing between senses, actually there's also an interesting phenomenon called synesthesia. So when you are simulating one particular senses, you may be able to activate concurrently the other senses. How these are actually working, I don't think we have a very clear understanding right now. Maybe there are some sort of cross-modal inhibition being disinhibited, but this could be a very hot topic. You can try to disintegrate and understand how things are integrated.
But you both avoided the question: is there going to be? Are we going to ultimately find one place where it all comes together, or?
I mean, so it's the old problem with the homunculus. I mean, is there the little man or woman inside, steering things, looking at the screen? We don't think that's there. Somehow the whole thing just works by itself, without referring to some center that's deciding on everything. But but we don't know how.
There's probably something towards the front of the brain that are doing these integrative stuff, like basal ganglia or striatum, but these areas are still being underdeveloped. So.
It's not one area, it's a network of areas, and it's how these areas communicate.
I was, just to maybe finish up this conversation about imagery, I'll throw this idea out here because it just came to me, and it could be completely ridiculous and wrong, but I wonder whether and to what degree visual imagery permits humans to create counterfactual thoughts that may also contribute to the inferences we make, and whether that means we can make better inferences than, let's say, other organisms that don't have that capacity. Is that a visual property, or? And, well.
So what's an example of what you're thinking of for the counterfactual?
Well, counterfactual would be like you have in your mind's eye an event occurring in a way different, or a hypothetical way in which an event may take place.
Yeah.
It's not taking place yet.
So again, I think that's a much more general thing that the brain does, that it can use vision for, but Helen Keller can do it too. For us, a lot of it might be visual because a lot of what we do with our brains is visual, but that's not. But there's a more general process that's using anything, using vision, using hearing, to make a picture of the world or of a possible world. Mm-hmm. I say picture, that's visual, but to make an imagination of.
I mean, this somewhat goes back to the debate of the 80s with Plishin and Koslin of is our mind's eye, does it have to be visual in order to answer visual questions, or can it be some type of linguistic form? And I think the fight is probably still out there, and I think there's not one answer to it.
Okay, well, I think we should open up to the audience if they want to. Please go up to the microphone. And folks, we insist on you going to the microphone just because it otherwise doesn't get picked up for our broadcasting. So. Thank you.
Okay, something that occurred to me after listening to this panel was that, I mean, it was addressed to some extent, but I would have thought that it would have been addressed more, is the issue of blindness. So for one thing, I'm wondering, people who never saw and are blind, when they dream, is it primarily auditory, or do they have dreams in taste and perception as well, and hearing? And the other thing that it makes me think of is that since there was a relationship between vision and concentration as well as emotions, has there been any studies in which it's been studied whether blind people have a different level of intelligence, because concentration is a part of intelligence, and also maybe blind people having different emotional responses since they don't have the vision input into developing their emotional connections as well?
Yeah, so about the intelligence, there were some studies trying to differentiate or compare between congenitally blind patients of people versus acquired blind people. It turns out that the early preliminary data suggests that the congenitally blind people may be able to perform arithmetics a little bit better than the acquired blind people. What does that mean? They have some intelligent difference? Would that visual area, so-called, no longer assigned to vision, but they are doing it for intelligence? Those are hypotheses we need to test further. Regarding the dreams, because congenital blind subjects do not have visual experience, I don't think they can really explain if they have visual dreams. But when we give the so-called sensory substitution devices to our acquired blind patients, sometimes they would say they can see some lights, some phosphins, so-called. Would they be able to see like visual dreams? I guess they may be because they have visual experience. But we have a study that there may be literature out there I'm not aware of. Yeah.
It's only applying to congenital blindness.
Right. Those were the studies trying to separate the two, and they're just comparing the two. Whether, yeah, go ahead.
That also reminds me of the observation expressed last time on hearing that congenitally deaf patients who get cochlear implants or other sorts of implants to restore hearing cannot process speech. If they've been exposed to speech and then lost their hearing, they can recover that, and they hear sounds that can be organized into speech patterns.
Hi, I had a question. I wanted to address synthetic and consciousness in two questions. I wonder if you could compare the computational efficiency as well as level of consciousness between artificial and kind of human intelligence as we understand. To give you an example, artificial neural networks, if you talk about vision and language kind of combined, a diffusion model, as opposed to just a language like a ChatGPT, they are 100 times, or 2 orders larger for language. And yet in the human brain, we have 20-30% of our cortex, a lot of it integrative, but still much more dedicated to vision as opposed to language, which is the opposite case in AI. So that speaks to the question of computational efficiency of the human brain. Has evolution kind of optimized for kind of a generality of vision at the cost of language efficiency? And the other question is on consciousness, 2-part question. The other thing is, if you ablated a human mind and you, for example, lost all vision modality, how would that affect your consciousness as opposed if you ablated your language centers in terms of consciousness? Because, there is that sense that most of our information comes from the world through vision, and so you imagine vision would be much more important. And yet, when I think about losing one of those 2 senses, I'd much rather be blind and be able to think about Proust and mathematics and history than I would be like my chicken or my dog, who have really acute vision and emotional experience, but can't really cognate on it, think on that. So consciousness and efficiency, could the panel speak to those 2 questions?
I just want to clarify, your chicken and your dog?
We raise chickens. I have a golden retriever.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, on the topic of computation efficiency, I suppose it is possible that developing data structures to most efficiently, one, represent the, the data that comes in, whether it be like natural language or imagery or a video, and on top of that, like processing it and computing what I mentioned earlier, attention, like the attention that we know today, and like sort of the current research of like generative AI and LLMs, it's essentially it's like a gigantic matrix multiplication problem, right? So you have to represent all your text as sort of if you have like a dictionary with like 1,000 tokens, like that's actually how many that's how big your vectors are, and that then that then affects how many, or sort of the computational power that's needed to then compute this gigantic matrix. And so, essentially what's happening in the brain is probably not that, but it's the representation that we need to feed into like the chips that we use to then, make these computations that then generate natural language. So yeah, it's very possible that what's going on in here is exactly not how we're actually modeling it mathematically.
But I think it can also go deeper. So this question of whether the computations are the same, but even deeper question is whether the aims are the same, right? Yes. So I think with take 3D vision, for instance. If you're thinking about computer vision, what you typically want is what's known as a 3D depth map, which is essentially the distance of each pixel in the image. And I don't think the human visual system produces anything like that. I think it's a very rough and ready approximation for whatever it needs in that particular moment. It's weird because we are seeing there's like the sort of next generation that some people want to think about AI building on human vision is to say, well, actually, there's a sort of a graphics engine in the head, right? So you've got these retinal images. There's a graphics engine in the head that sort of simulates all these different images based on the illumination, based on the objects, based on all these things, and then compares them to the retinal image and works out these things. And that sounds like a potential approach for computer vision, but it just, for me at least, it sounds a million miles away from what I think human vision is doing.
But as a neuroscientist, from the biology of it, why would humans be the inverse of AI in terms of dedicating so much processing power to vision when in AI it seems relatively trivial compared to language?
But I think the difference also is that in AI, we're talking about like statistical regularities to get us to our understanding, whereas with humans, language is much more rich than that. And I think it's a little bit of comparing apples to oranges.
There's a commercial interest also. I mean, the interest in visual, artificial vision, I think a lot of it relates to driving cars, right? That's driving a lot of the research. And for language models, it's a way to engage people. And I think that's, obviously we see this as very hot, right? Can we fake people into thinking these are conscious beings that you're talking to? And, there's money there, I think. That may also explain the sequence.
Well, the other more interesting question is on consciousness. That is, when I think about vision and I think about consciousness, I think about integrating. One definition of intelligence is to be able to predict. And so I think of a physics engine. When I think of visual, I think of, can I predict what's going to happen if that person drops that? So that's kind of the consciousness. Maybe there's something beyond that that you could tell us about. But when I think about language and I think about consciousness, I think about really the definition of being human. So how would you compare those two modalities in terms of consciousness, vision versus language, and what are kind of the ceilings, how do they interact?
I mean, I think as scientists we have to be honest, which is, if we were looking at the human brain and human behavior from the outside, I don't think we'd hypothesize consciousness, right? I think it has to be the fact that we experience it ourselves. And so I'm going to plead ignorance at this point and say we just don't have the conceptual tools at the moment to I mean, look, for myself, I think there's some interesting questions in 3D vision. So we have 3D visual experience. So that for myself, that would rule out the retina and the next stage, the LGN, and knock us up to the visual cortices. But then after that, it's a real all bets are off. So, yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't be inclined to try to compare the raw computational resources used in AI doing something versus the brain doing something, because it's just not at all clear that the algorithms are the same. I mean, in vision, at least, there's more quantitative measures of to what extent the representations are the same, which is sort of a half full, half empty kind of question. But there is at least a fair amount of similarity in the representations. But in language, I think all bets are off. I mean, as you were saying, it's the large language models are purely statistical, and frankly, nobody knows how they work. I mean, it was the people who developed the large language models did not anticipate they were going to develop large language models that were that powerful. I mean, they were just trying to predict the next word, and the damn thing could write essays. It just, nobody expected that, and I don't think anybody knows how it works. But our language is much more tied to whatever our brain thinks is reality, and not just statistics and putting words together, and that's just a completely different computation.
Is my conception of consciousness in the visual realm, is that kind of a simplistic idea about a physics engine and predicting what happens in the next frame? Is there a higher level of consciousness that I'm missing?
Yeah, I don't think we have the conceptual tools to talk about consciousness.
Okay, that was the hard questions.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Well, go ahead up, please.
There's something about this that I find very frustrating, coming as I do from very different disciplines. And it seems to me that what frustrates me most is the need for some kind of unification. In other words, I get a lot of really good, interesting pieces, right? But I can't put them together. By the way, the disciplines I came from were psychotherapy, and the other one was fine arts, right? So, in other words, being so involved in the world, being so involved in experience through something subjective, right, is what I find so frustrating about something that does a terrific job of taking things apart but doesn't quite put them together. The one discipline that I see is trying to put them together, and I'm not a friend of this discipline, is AI. This is my difficulty, and how do you try to bring that unity to that experience?
I think there's something to be said for divide and conquer, insofar as the kind of stuff that interests me is very low level visual processing of stereo vision in 3D, and I think part of the reason it interests me is that actually, so long as I know the separation between your eyes, so long as I know that your eyes have particularly good resolution, and some people have some cortical, some brain deficits with stereo vision, but on the whole, people generally have it. Given those things, given those basic assumptions, then actually the kind of effects that you see in people are pretty generalizable, right? They're not particularly subjective. But I presume when we go into other areas of vision that get associated with the more subjective, then you really do sort of go diverging into very different sort of responses depending on who you ask, which is what you alluded to. But for myself, I'd also presume that those conclusions build out on the sort of lower level, earlier visual processes. So yeah, in terms of putting it all together and how we do it, you've got an option, right? You can either stay at the very low level like I like to do and hope to focus on those, in which case you can get I hope at least a fairly unified account of visual processing, visual experience. Or you go up to your kinds of questions, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would say you find it very frustrating. I find it really exciting. I think this is where the magic is. And I think that the more that we can study this, the more we understand how humans process the world. So I think that's what makes humans amazing, actually, and makes us so different from computers.
And also, I think that our goal in neuroscience, or in any science, is to develop, a deep, unified understanding of the process. But the frustration, we all have the frustration. We would like to understand how the brain works, and we don't. We'd like to understand how we have a unified experience, and from whatever sensory information we happen to have access to, and whatever history and memory we have access to, but we don't. And so it's a long, arduous process. I mean, physics had to understand a lot of very specific things before they finally got to a grand unified theory, almost. Not quite, but they're a lot closer than they used to be. So it's just a long process in science to get to the unified answer that we all dream of.
And I'm optimistic there are different puzzles.
Just have to live another 100 years.
Yeah, I guess we are now currently touching different parts of the elements, but at one point we will be able to see the whole pictures, and together with even along the whole lifespan, if we want to touch back to the fine arts thing or Picasso thing, actually for youngsters who can draw well, they tend to have good visual memory, and all these are flexible, they can be developed, but how these development thing, processing, and then the pieces of eye versus mental imagery and other processing can be put together into a unified version. We're really looking forward to that. Maybe AI currently is in the stage of artificial narrow intelligence. It's of similar stages. We are pushing towards artificial general intelligence or even artificial consciousness intelligence, but there's a big gap before we can really reach that.
The stories of the cathedrals in Europe that took hundreds of years to build, and each generation would put some bricks in, and then their children would put some more bricks in, and it would go on like that for generations and generations and generations. And that's what science is. We're not going to build the cathedral in our own lifetimes.
Please, Lisa.
I think just as, that's what I tell my students all the time. The more that I know, the more that I realize I don't know, right?
It reminds me, that's exactly what I was going to get at, is that, well, first of all, I was very impressed by how everyone in the panel was able to say, I don't really know, or we can't fill those gaps right now, and I think that's wonderful scientific honesty. Also, it's so nice to hear you say that it's part of what you said, magic or mystery of the human experience. And of course, this is the space that not only scientists can explore in their creative and imaginary ways, but also, of course, visual artists. I mean, in terms of vision. So it's an opportunity for artists also to get in there and to work that space and enlighten us in some other sorts of ways that we can't maybe exactly put language to. So I want to thank everyone again for this excellent panel, and would look forward to our audience coming back in the fall for our roster of new roundtables. Thank you again.